represents, I don't know, the difficulties of futurist thinking, and the difficulties really of prophecy, and one sort of immediate urge to kind of like seize on the kind of brightest, geekiest, freakiest, most sense of wonder interpretation of what the future might hold, as opposed to what the future actually holds, which is another matter entirely, really. I want to say a kind word about anthropologists and science fiction writers. As it so happened, my first literary mentor in the world of science fiction was an anthropologist. He was a guy named Chad Oliver, who was the chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas. Point of fact, the guy worked in Africa. He did a lot of field work in Kenya, Dr. Oliver, and he was also a rather well-known science fiction writer in his day. And if I learned anything from this guy, who really was kind of my literary mentor in the field, it was not to get too bogged down in the parochialisms of time and space, but really to try and step back and take a more analytical approach, right? And not really get too sunk in one particular line of work either. So, I've always treasured a kind of anthropological approach to science fiction. Although, I'm fiercely loyal to it and born and bred in the bone, and, I really do it, and I belong to the Science Fiction Writers of America, and I make no bones about being a science fiction writer. If you don't know anything at all about science fiction, but you have a kind of deep anthropological interest in the subculture, there are two books you ought to look at, and I'll spell them for you so you can go buy them. First is the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction by John Clute, C-L-U-T-E. Huge thing. This big. Just read the biggest entries. It's the only real work of scholarship about the field. 700 pages long, but it's the Bible. And it's and if you want sort of a literary critical assessment, there's a book from the late 80s, early 90s, Trillion Year Spree by the British science fiction writer Brian Aldiss, A-L-D-I-S-S. It's really the best kind of summary from inside the field of what practitioners within science fiction think they're trying to do, and the various sort of science fictional threads and means of expression. And yes, we have a religious wing, and yes, we have a New Age wing, and yes, we have a sort of futurist wing, and yes, we have an antiquarian wing, and we have rivalries, and there are the various kinds of nationalist aspects. There's European science fiction, North American science fiction, right wing, left wing, progressive, conservative. It's a little world all its own. You go have a look. It's the pop culture wing of science fiction is in a lot of ways. With all the sort of downsides and upsides of that. And it's also the geek wing of literature, which is kind of underappreciated. And it's related to other fields. Science fiction is a lot like futurism, although not all science fiction is about the future. Futurist thinking has a lot to tell us, and I do a lot of futurism. It's very similar to industrial design, which was born at the same time and in the same milieu. It was born in the 1920s in the USA. And, born in a rather dark period, late 20s, early 30s. And, it also is related to literature, although, I don't believe it's really a wing of literature. It is at least a work of print. So, one has to wonder why it has ended up in the sort of the current muddle that it is. And it is. It's an odd thing to be doing now, and even looks slightly archaic. When you tell people you're a science fiction writer, they often ask, well, what do you really do? And in point of fact, you can do nothing but science fiction, but quite often science fiction writers do a lot of other stuff. Typically they write pop science, which I do, or they may be tech journalists, which I am, or they may be scientists, or they may be engineers or practitioners in a technical field, or they may actually be futurist consultants, which a few of us are, and a few of us are kind of into design, and some of us are just plain literateurs. Our difficulties come, or at least we share our difficulties with these other lines, professions, which have a similar kind of zeitgeist problem that we in science fiction do. Science, in particular, is having a tough time of it lately. This is not a very scientifically progressive period. This is an obscurantist period. You know, the sort of original notions behind science, kind of 16th century science and even Aristotelian science, is that the universe has purpose and is humanly comprehensible, and that what we'll eventually find some kind of grand unified theory which can be sort of written on the back of a postcard and kind of make everything clear and immediately comprehensible. And in point of fact, that's proving quite difficult to find. I mean, even physicists rarely make these declarations anymore, whereas science fiction tends to have really, tends to espouse a different and sort of more peculiar approach to the universe, which is that the universe is astounding and wondrous and frequently weird and scary. And you can find certain classics of the field like H.P. Lovecraft, who, unlike any scientist, would boldly declare that reality is a mind-wrecking chaos, and that if we actually knew what was going on in the universe, we would go insane immediately. You know, there are certain authors who aspire kind of go-get sense of wonder and awe, which manages to last. Olaf Stapleton, I think, would be an excellent version of that. Aldous called him sort of a great gray mountain of our field, and I think Stapleton is a kind of ultimate science fiction writer in some ways, but he's rather little read, because he really does astound you. I mean, he just keeps blowing your mind relentlessly. We have a sarcastic wing and a kind of down wing, which are personified by Huxley and Orwell, who write stories of dread and foreboding and dark and terrible prognostications. If you read Huxley's Brave New World, which I recommend thoroughly, it's amazing how much it is like the 1970s. You know, we've actually kind of lived through the worst things he imagined and plunged right deeper into the pit. So, you know, that's our difficulty, I mean, one among many. Fiction has difficulties because fiction, literature, believes in the press. It thinks that literary expression is about ink on paper. And I just don't think that's really going to be true much longer, even if you think that it is. It's you know, very dependent on the means of production, fiction and literature. And those are really under stress now, probably as much as they've been since the invention of the printing press hundreds of years ago. It's really catching it. Design has problems. Design used to, sort of modernist design was about the sort of burning conviction that objects and services have an ideal and perfect form. And that this ideal and perfect form, the design solution, will be revealed if you take away everything that is not functional. And this doesn't in fact work. It just doesn't work. And if you look at contemporary design, you actually see objects which are clearly driven by a kind of whimsy, really like an Alessi tea strainer or a little plastic objects, holding on to it, you know. Or they're market-driven and sort of based by consumer research, where the designer sort of goes out and pans huge numbers of people, please, please tell us what you desire. Or they're intended to like provoke love for the brand, or branding allegiance, which is sort of very different from the earlier sort of clean, modernist schemes of design. And futurists, who in the 1960s sort of felt that they are sort of their intellectual heirs, would end up in a position of anticipation through command and control, where that you can find the key change drivers, watch them, get ahead of the game, outguess what's going to happen, look at the seeds of things, invest in the needs, move things ahead. The Japanese were huge at this, the kind of Ministry of Industry and Trade. You're sort of like, go out there, get ahead of the command curve, and, you know, and like take sort of, well, that's pretty well gone. In fact, if you hang out with futurists, you'll find they're very old-fashioned trade, really. Most futurists are pretty gray-haired guys. It's very young, very rare to meet a young futurist or a young self-declared futurist. A contemporary futurist will probably describe himself as a market analyst or an early venture capitalist, even though he does, you know, exactly the same kind of things that Herman Kahn and his colleagues were pioneering in the 1960s. There's just sort of no illusion left that there's a central place you can go pull the analytical levers, or, you know, punch the series of buttons and come out with a clean kind of slate. for, what to do next. That's problematic, and what does science fiction bring to this mix? I mean, I'd like to think we're worth something. It's hard to say exactly what, except that we do think dramatically. We think dramatically rather than analytically. And we can also, think satirically, which is frequently very useful. I mean, Huxley's book is a satire. The work of Albert Robida is a satire. Quite frequently, you can predict the future very accurately if you just find the things that make people in the present day most nervous and embarrassed. I mean, just describe the things that they secretly fear or are worried about. Like, say, Albert Robida, who did a brilliant satirical cartoon collection about life in the 20th century. One of the most effective cartoons in that book is a bunch of men standing around taking orders from a female general. It's like, ha, 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 female general, oh, that's a thigh slapper, no, of course, Yeah, I mean, it's very rare to see women in positions of power in 19th century science fiction. You'd never find that in Kipling, Huxley, whoever. But yeah, Robida, he could see through that. He just had a good understanding of what it is that sort of made people nervous. Cyberspace is a feat of the literary imagination. And I can remember seeing the word kind of written on a manually typed piece of paper, William Gibson's famous manual typewriter. And I looked at it and I immediately knew that the term had legs. It's like, okay, this is something people are going to use. Wow, cyberspace, what a great neologism. I will point out that it's a dated term and it's a period term. I mean, people are going to be using cyberspace for another 20 years, but they're mostly going to use it in order to refer back to the kind of pre-dot-com frenzy of the 90s. It's sacrificed to history. There was never a Gibsonian cyberspace in the sense that he described it in these science fiction novels. In a Gibsonian cyberspace, it's a mentally induced experience. You take electrodes and you put them on your head, and it affects your brain patterns, and you see things. You literally hallucinate them. It's a consensual hallucination. It's an electronically induced mental world. A kind of telepathy that you share with other people on the network. That hasn't happened. That's never going to happen. It might, but it's not going to be called cyberspace should such a thing be occurring. And we're not going to see the kind of secondary space of ones and zeros where nobody knows you're a dog, which is like absolutely and totally and ontologically separate from the kind of everyday atoms world. The kind of distinction that we made between bits and atoms, or the virtual and the actual, is a period distinction. It's going away. You can just sit there and watch it day by day. You can see people laminating those two worlds. Just go look at Google Earth, or kind of urban read-write things. Or the internet itself is moving pretty rapidly away from a means of information to a means of production. It's not a sort of other world where we go stack all our bits in a kind of Euclidean non-space of the mind. No, it's actually the operating system for mid-21st century society. It's where you buy stuff, it's where you sell stuff, it's where you keep your money, it's where you order things, it's where you make things. It's the command and control system for the natural world. And in any case, bits are bits of atoms. I mean, bits are bits of atoms. There are no immaterial bits that don't exist. The internet is a real thing. It's a physical thing. If you go into a router station where cyberspace, quote unquote, is maintained, you can see diesel engines parked outside. The thing's blazingly hot. It's got chunks of silicon in there that are hotter than pancake griddles, just moving those illusions through your front door. And if an asteroid hits one of those, or there's an earthquake, your space goes away. It's a real thing. I mean, it's an engine, it's a machine, and it has to be fed. I mean, the Internet of Things is coming. It just is. It's the Internet, which is, a physical Internet. The things are tagged and logged and moved and traced. Just look up the term geolocative, or just look up Google Earth. Just get directions across the surface of the planet. Just look at the Earth on Google Earth. I'm a guy who does rather a lot of strange things, and I'm a science fiction writer, but I do have deep interest in futurism and design, and I've written a futurist book as a futurist, and I've even written a little design book as a design theorist. And I work in all three of these lines, and when I'm doing design or hang out with design people, I'm really happy about it, and I feel very affirmative, and it's like, wow, it's shiny, it's pretty, you guys are so well thought through, It's like, oh, the ingenuity of your design process, let me write that up, and I'm like, they're good pals of mine, and I really enjoy their company, I learn a lot from them, and I'm kind of a journalist and something of a groupie theorist kind of figure there. And when I hang out with futurists, I think, oh, what great material, you're so good at sort of staying ahead of the curve. Gosh, I hadn't heard that yet, thank you very much. I'm going to be able to write that up sometime, you're so knowledgeable. Well, that's fantastic, you guys are great. Ask me back again. And then I sit down to do some work at science fiction, and I suffer. I suffer like the way a creative artist suffers. And I'm really like beads of blood are appearing on my forehead. And I'm like obsessing over semicolons and rewriting the thing again and again, sort of critically assessing it and really kind of doing heavy lifting. And I complain to my nearest and dearest, and I make other people's lives miserable in order to make sure they know how badly off I am. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm a professional in that line of work. And in the two others, I'm kind of a journalist dilettante figure. And it's kind of sad, but that's the reality. It's actually easier, I believe, for a science fiction writer to become a futurist, or even a designer, than it is for a futurist or a designer to become a science fiction writer. Mostly because they wouldn't want to bother. And in order to become a science fiction writer, you really have to take some long and deep steps into a very crabbed and peculiar kind of subculture. Design is a method of action, really. It's a way to do stuff. It's a way to make stuff. And futurism is a method of vision. It's a way to anticipate stuff. It's a way to predict stuff and get ahead of stuff. Whereas science fiction is a culture. It's a culture. It's a pop subculture which is mostly inhabited by people who are bright and cranky and poorly socialized. They're not all bohemians, but they are the crooked wood of which mankind cannot be built straight. People in the science fiction subculture are really into it, and they're just not, they're not your common sort of user. They're not merely a demographic. They have a lot of otherness about them, and a kind of irretrievable kind of squid in the mouth otherness that it's a little difficult to describe, but very much there. And that acts as a kind of membrane of differential between the science fiction subculture and the rest. And and it's difficult to get your head around until you've sort of hung out with them and understood them. So it would be a little difficult for an industrial designer to just sort of toss off a science fiction novel. And sort of have it accepted. Whereas it was not really that big a step for me to go teach in design school, which I have been known to do. I taught industrial design about industries that don't exist yet. Which sounds like an odd thing to do, but I think this actually has some legs. I would suspect that teaching industrial design, trying to get people to anticipate industries which aren't there, to actually build, sort of leap and the net will appear, is something you see very commonly in practice. It's the Silicon Valley ethos. To sort of like build it for what isn't quite there yet, or to skate where the hockey puck will be. And there I actually have some things to offer to the industry, the trade, to design. I'm still on very good terms with the people at that school. And in fact, I'm going to go hang out at another one for a little while here. What can science fiction writers and designers and futurists tell you? What good are they? What can they tell you that you don't already know? And it's kind of a good question. And what they can tell you is, in point of fact, things you don't already know. because quite commonly they've studied things you just don't know about and aren't going to affect you for some time. But they could be there. It took me a while to realize this, in the prophecy game, because people often come up to me and say, that thing you wrote about in the science fiction novel? Well, by golly, I went out and I made my living doing that, and now I've got one here in a box for you. And so you must be fantastically insightful, and perhaps you have supernatural powers of some kind. No. I mean, the best way to predict the future is to just tell people what's happening now. You just tell them about something that you know to be a physical fact, which they have not become acquainted with. If it's futuristic to them, it's futuristic. It's that simple. I mean, there really isn't any other definition of the term. And I got quite used to this, actually. In fact, I've been known to predict things and then find that they're already occurring. And that actually encourages me a great deal, because it doesn't mean I'm wrong. It means that my line of analysis is correct. I thought it must be happening, and by golly, it already happened. In fact, it happened 2 years ago, and I just didn't hear about it. Well, there's a lot going on, more than any of us can ever know. We're very ignorant about what's happened in our own time, and even what happened in the past. If you can simply tell somebody, just kind of make it clear to them, you have, in some sense, predicted the future. I mean, you're a successful prophet. And frequently you can tell them and then show them the evidence that you base that on, and they're unable to perceive why that evidence would make you say such a thing. But, you can get used to it. It's not really that difficult. There are certain things you can look at. Technological S-curves, very common. The Gartner hype cycle. If you've never heard of Gartner is a group of futurists, corporate futurist consultants, Gartner. Just go Google that. The Gartner hype cycle. It's sort of cruel but true. The Gartner hype cycle is about the frantic exaggerations that are attached to a new piece of technology before people know what it's good for. And that's what hype is. But, you see a lot of hype, and futurists are in the business of spreading it. And so are tech journalists and even science fiction writers and designers. They're all hyping things relentlessly. And it's always falling short at the beginning. And then there's sort of a trough of disillusionment. And then there's a group of people who catch on and begin to build it up. And then it slowly eats its way through the earlier order until it becomes the accepted means. And you can track it. I mean, you can measure it. You can just tell by looking at newspapers at what stage something is. And it's not that hard. I mean, you get to learn these things. Wild cards, weak signals, landmark events. Futurists go out and read white papers. Tech reports, or just the buzz of the futurist community, or just what science fiction writers are finding sexy at some particular moment. It's not that hard. I mean, I could predict what people are talking about right now if they're futurists. If you're a futurist right now and you're hanging out with your client who's asking you, what does the future bring? I can almost guarantee you he's going to say, do you have an innovation strategy in your company? What are you doing to placate the creative class? What about China and offshoring? Are you prepared for that? Do you still have one of those old, boring, black and white, static, page-driven websites, or do you have a new, dynamic, Ajax-driven Web 2.0 social website? Are you concerned about interactivity with your customers? Have you dragged your customer inside to have a naked conversation with them, trying to make him part of the process? Have you done anything about sustainability issues? Do you know carbon will be taxed soon? And what he will not talk about is the terror. The terror. It went away while no one was looking. Bush isn't even out of office, but it's just gone. The terror bubble broke. And now there's military defeat and probably a lot more terror and people being horribly torn to pieces, and we could have a nuclear exchange at practically any moment, and New York could be black glass in 2 months, and none of that actually changed. It's just the tenor of the times changed, and the terror is now very Bush 1. It's something you don't talk about, its time is gone, it's kind of an embarrassment to discuss. The terror is not the future. Well, you may ask, but yes, it's gone. The war for oil There isn't really a war for oil. I mean, yes, there's a war for oil. There's probably going to be lots of wars for oil. The war on oil is sexy. No. What I think is really different about this, and I'm running out of time, but I want to try and sum it up here. I think the thing that's most different about the present day, and the thing that sort of really has me galvanized at the moment, is that everybody is using the same screens. The anthropologist uses a screen, the journalist uses a screen. I've got one of these in my laptop bag over there. We're not all Mac users, but we're sort of all laptop gypsies. We all use the same search engines. We're not on the same mailing list, but we're using the same means of cultural production. They're changing all of us. There's a communication glut in some ways, because we're in a world of publish and search rather than search and then publish. We're just communicating a whole lot. But at the same time, we're in a kind of new cultural internet bouillabaisse, which never happened before. And this makes me wonder what to call myself. I mean, I call myself a science fiction writer because it's traditional, and it would be embarrassing not to say that. But something like 20 years ago, I realized that it was a small anthropological niche, and you couldn't really do effective work as a science fiction writer strictly from within that milieu. So I thought to myself, well, what's my real description? I mean, what am I really doing? What is going to sort of free me from this parochialism and allow me to sort of bring some fresh energy into my field, update it, make it more effective? And I decided that I was an artist. And that I was an artist whose theme was the impact of technology on society. Because that's sort of how I saw things in the 1980s. And I thought, okay, well, if this is my job, then I can talk to futurists. I could talk to designers. I could take them seriously. I'll just go out there, I'll learn what they learn. They're doing the same things I'm doing in some ways, and they'll have a useful tool set for me. They'll broaden my thinking. It's okay. So I did that. And then I realized, when I learned more about technology and society, that it was not about the impact of technology on society. That was a bad way to frame it. It was about the interplay between technology and society, because a lot of technologies are socially determined. They're all you could take the same technology, put it in 5 different societies, get radically different developmental curves. People will handle things differently. Why is Europe covered with trains? Why was the US formerly covered with trains? That sort of thing. And then I realized that there wasn't any difference. That the society was breeding the technology, and the technology was breeding the society. And that what I really should describe myself as a student of the techno-social. That I needed to understand that there was one thing. It was not like 2 Siamese twins. It was a single entity. That the techno-social was sort of where it was at, and I sort of needed to get to the heart and the guts of it. What did it mean? How did it feel? I wanted to be a literateur of the techno-social. And then I began to realize that it wasn't doing all that well. And a lot of the things in the techno-social that were clearly not sustainable and weren't going to go on, and were sort of headed for a crunch. And at that point, I began to think of myself as a techno-social activist. And I began to take on this kind of gray-beard, polymath, guru, prophetic figure. And I started going out and actually teaching people and kind of propagandizing and really sort of intervening in design instead of just writing about it, and intervening in futurism and trying to tell them what was going wrong, what was going wrong. And now I see myself in this kind of stew of internet hardware and software, where all the little stovepipes and tide pools that used to separate these disciplines and subcultures are being radically melted down, just put together in a new digital 21st century bouillabaisse. And this is just starting. And the true impact of this kind of hybrid media, Creole media, physical media, is just here. And I don't know what to call what I think I have to do. I only worry that I'll be too vague to get anything done. So, thank you.